So now we get into a set of questions that are very complicated and very interesting, and I think important to this debate and also important to a lot of philosophical debates. And those are questions of responsibility, questions of free will. These are huge philosophical questions. They get very complicated very quickly. You could spend, and some people do spend, entire semesters, multiple semesters sometimes, on issues of free will. Big, thick, very difficult books are written on this. Um, we're not going to get too deeply into these questions of free will. Very complicated. If we do, we're going to do nothing else the entire semester. I would like to do other things this semester, right? But I think it is important to at least touch on these questions. To settle this question, are addicts responsible for their actions? This will have really important, implications, really important things to say about these questions of public policy. What do we do with addicts, right? Questions of free will and responsibility, even though we can't dive into them too deeply, they're also going to be really important when we get to this distributive justice debate. Questions about who should get what, questions about what society or the better off owe the less fortunate, right? So it's good to raise them because they will be important. Again, it's also important to raise them because they have really important implications for addiction. Well, for one, let's think about what hinges on this question, why it's important. Well, we need to settle this question if addicts are responsible to decide whether we should punish addicts, right? If people aren't responsible for their actions, it's just cruel, it's just wrong to punish them, right? Think about it this way, right? If someone is sleepwalking and he hits somebody, say his roommate tries to wake him up, or, her husband tries to wake her up, and they just slug the person, if they're sleepwalking, we would say they're not responsible. If you do something while sleepwalking, hit another person, set the house on fire, whatever, it would be wrong to punish you if you really are sleepwalking because you don't have any real control over what you do while you're sleepwalking, right? I've only ever walked in my sleep twice in my life. It was utterly terrifying both times. Anyway, if you've done it more than once, my sympathies. It is twice in 41 years I've done it, and just I'm still scared thinking about it, right? But also, insanity, right? If someone is legitimately insane and they commit a crime for it, we'll get them help, we'll get them treatment, but again, we think it would be wrong, we think it would be cruel to punish people for things they do if they're insane, and because they're insane, because they're not responsible, right? If addicts aren't responsible for their actions, well, it would also be cruel to punish them. We shouldn't do it. We shouldn't send them to jail. We should get them help. And the second question is, do we treat addiction like a disability? Now think of this, right? Let me give you guys, a contrast between two cases. I knew a guy when I was in college who was just about the laziest person I've ever met, right? I don't know how he finished college, he did, but part of this guy's laziness was he just didn't like to walk anywhere. He would get in his car and drive 100 feet and park because he didn't want to walk 100 feet, right? Nothing wrong with his legs, he was just really lazy. Now look, none of us would think this guy, let's call him Matt, none of us would think that Matt deserves any allowances from society, right? If Matt says, well, I need a parking space close to any building I want to go into, And we say, okay, Matt, why do you need that? And Matt says, well, I really hate walking. Just really don't like to do it. Our answer here would be, well, tough luck, Matt. You don't like to walk. Doesn't mean we have to block out a parking space for you so you never have to do it. People have to do lots of things in life they don't like doing, right? Now contrast Matt with somebody who legitimately has mobility issues. They might have a broken leg, they might be paralyzed, whatever. We would say, yeah, okay, we're going to give you a handicap spot because you need it, you have a legitimate disability, we should make allowances for you, right? Buildings under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they have to be accessible, they have to have ramps. If you have a disability, it's a good reason that we have to make these allowances in a way that we don't for people like Matt, right? And, think about this, right? Think about assignments or work, right? If someone has a legitimate disability, a legitimate medical condition, let's say they're epileptic and they have a seizure and can't make work because of it, or they're diabetic and, their blood sugar crashes, or they are subject to migraines and have a horrible headache and can't get out of bed all day, we would all say people's workplaces should make allowances for that. They should excuse people from work within reason. Schools should do the same. Excuse people from assignments, make allowances, all that for disabilities, right? Contrast that again with somebody like Matt, who just says, yeah, it was raining. I don't like to leave the house when it's raining. It's cold. See, I'm just really lazy. I don't like to leave the house, so I didn't come into work today. We would not hesitate to say, okay, Matt, they're going to fire you, right? You can help it. It's your fault you didn't come into work. People with medical conditions, people with legitimate disabilities, it is in no way their fault. We should make allowances for them. We don't make allowances for you, Matt. If addiction is really a disability, then we would have to make allowances for addiction, right? It would be wrong to fire people for missing work because they have drug problems, or at least we should make allowances, right? We should make allowances in other areas too for people who are addicts if addiction is really like a disability. So, do we blame addicts for not doing certain things, or do we say, well, it's not your fault because addiction is a disability, it's like a disease, right? In the case in the podcast I had you guys listen to, McKelvey made this claim. It's like, well, look, yeah, I didn't take advantage of my benefits within the time, but there's an allowance if it's a medical condition or disability. I'm an alcoholic. That's a disability. You can't blame me. It's wrong to not give me these benefits because of my condition of alcoholism. Finally, does society owe addicts help? Look, we would think, this goes back to disability, we would think most of us do, that if people are disabled, society owes them forms of help to allow them to have normal functioning, right? Buildings have to have ramps. We put in the clicking things on crosswalks so people who are deaf can cross the street safely. More radically, if you end up injured or so disabled that you can't work, then there's support from Social Security, other programs. People get financial support so they can live a decent life if they're too disabled to work, right? And most of us, what I think that's a morally good thing. Society should do that. Again, contrast this with a guy like Matt who says, yeah, I don't want to work. And we say, well, why is that, Matt? And Matt says, well, work really stinks. I mean, who wants to do that? I'm really lazy. I really don't like doing that. And I think we would say, tough luck, Matt, you have to work. If somebody on the other hand said, if we said, well, why can't you work? And they said, well, I fell off of a building at work. I injured my back. I have really bad pain if I try to do my job. That's a good reason somebody can't work. Most of us, a lot of us would say society owes this person some help, right? If they really can't do their work anymore because of a disability, we probably as a society owe them some kind of support. Matt, on the other hand, it would be really outrageous if we said, oh yeah, Matt, society needs to give Matt a check every month because Matt's really lazy, right? Well, are addicts like the person with a disability? Should society give addicts some form of support, some form of help? If it should, then, this idea that we treat addiction like a disease, we owe addicts treatment programs, help, and living a normal life, that all follows, right? So I hope you guys can see this is a really important question. Okay, so why in the world think that addicts aren't responsible? Well, the common reason given for this, and the reason they talk about in the Hi-Fi Nation podcast, is that addiction is a disease, right? You hear this a lot. In a lot of circles, this is just a commonplace. Addiction is a disease. Now we'll come back to this, but let's just accept it for the sake of argument. Addiction is a disease just as much as diabetes or anything else is a disease, right? What would that mean? Would that mean that addicts aren't responsible? Well, it might be a bit more complicated than it seems, right? Look, because you say, well, if addiction's a disease, obviously we don't blame people for diseases. You have no control over whether your blood sugar is high or low. You can't will whether you have a migraine or not. No one would ever will to have a migraine, right? The claim in addiction is a disease, it's like, well, addicts can no longer help themselves. They can't choose whether they do drugs or drink or not. There's something diseased with their will. The addict, in shooting heroin or taking a drink or whatever, doing meth, whatever their drug is, that's no more up to them than it is up to the diabetic that her blood sugar falls, or up to the epileptic that he has a seizure, right? They have a disease, these things happen to them. You shouldn't blame them. It would be just cruel, just a mean, awful thing to blame this person. Well, if the alcoholic can't help taking a drink, or the heroin addict can't help shooting up, or whatever, it would be cruel to blame them in the same way. Why? Control condition, you'll hear about this a lot in philosophy. If you ever take an ethics class, take one of my ethics classes, we spend a couple weeks on this. Not devoted entirely to it, but it comes up here and there repeatedly. And the idea is to be responsible for something, it must be in your control. You have a medical condition, it's not in your control to suffer symptoms from it. The thought is, if you are an addict, and addiction really is a disease, it's not in your control whether to use the drug or not. So addicts can't be responsible. Or can they? Would addiction being a disease really mean that addicts are not responsible? Seems to be a case on both sides. On the one hand, it seems if we buy this claim addiction is a disease, they can no longer choose whether to use the drug or not. If you're an alcoholic, then in one sense, if this addiction is a disease model is correct, then you fail the control condition. You can't choose whether or not to have a drink. your will is in a sense diseased. You can't choose, if you're a cocaine addict, whether or not to sniff cocaine. Meth addict, control whether to use meth or not. It's just not up to you. But even if addiction is a disease, there does seem to be a sense of control, right? Nobody is born an addict, right? Nobody who's never taken a drink in their lives has uncontrollable compulsion to drink. Addiction starts as a habit, right? People who are addicts slowly fell into this bad habit and became addicts, right? And you might say at one point, addicts had a choice. Even if addiction is a disease, in the sense that once you become an addict, you can no longer help whether or not you use or not, you did earlier make choices that made you into an addict, right? You formed these bad habits. There are some very deep arguments here. You kind of get into some fundamental debates in philosophy. Aristotle, really one of the foundational figures of philosophy. We don't talk about him, just can't do everything you'd like in this course. But Aristotle talked about this, right? Aristotle said, if you form bad habits, you might eventually become the kind of person who can't help doing the wrong thing. You're still responsible because you formed bad habits. The epileptic did not make herself into an epileptic. It just happened to her. The person with bad habits did make himself into a person with bad habits. So even if once you have the bad habits, you can't help it, there might be a sense where it's still under your control. Now, the response here is, well, look, diabetics might, in a sense, be responsible. There might be some element of personal choice if you have a bad diet. Even saying that, it would be cruel, it would be wrong to just say, well, it's your fault for being diabetic, whatever, right? So even if there's some element of personal responsibility, doesn't mean that, we just blame addicts if addiction really is a disease if they can't help themselves. We get into these complicated questions. How much is it up to them? How much is it not? Here's the thing, though. These are interesting, important debates. If you take future philosophy classes, they will come up, and they're interesting, and they're things, we should talk about if we get deeper into philosophy. The thing is, in just talking about drugs and drug users, we can avoid these debates. Well, why is that? Well, we can avoid them because there's pretty good evidence that heavy substance abusers can control whether they use or not. The epileptic can't control whether she has a seizure. Well, it looks like drugs are different. Diabetic can't control whether his blood sugar, at least he can't directly control, he can't will whether it goes up or down. It looks like our evidence is that addicts can actually control whether they use. And in a sense, I'm going to use this term heavy substance abusers because I think this term addict is kind of loaded. When we talk about addicts, we almost tend to assume it's somebody who can't help themselves. I don't want to beg that question, make that assumption. But let's look at the evidence that heavy users can control their actions. The podcast actually does a good job of summing up this evidence. One of the big pieces of evidence is that most heavy users, or people you might even call addicts, actually quit or moderate their use on their own. They talk about this in the podcast. If you guys check out the Drugs and Drug Policy book that I've mentioned several times, it confirms it. Most addicts or heavy users, like I said, I have some problems with the term addicts for reasons I'll get more deeply into. But most people, even the most problematic, heaviest users, people who by any definition we would probably say qualify as addicts, most of them quit on their own. Or they moderate their use on their own. They don't have to go into rehab. They don't go through AA or other 12-step programs. And look, if addiction really made it the case that you literally cannot choose whether to do a drug or not, this would be impossible, right? It wouldn't be the case that most heavy users quit on their own, or it would be that no heavy users or addicts could quit on their own. But the evidence is that isn't the case. Plenty of people do it. In fact, the majority of people who have problems do it. So it seems that this is really good evidence that addicts have some kind of choice. Another bit of evidence here is that in a number of studies, if you give somebody who is a heavy user, who is by any kind of accepted psychological definition an addict, if you offer them a reward not to use drugs, they'll often not use drugs, right? She mentions studies by this guy Hart. You take cocaine addicts, give them the opportunity to do a hit or get some money. Many cases, they will take the money rather than do the hit. Seems to show addicts can control their behavior, right? And I know what you'll say. Well, they're just going to spend that money on a hit later. But the point is, they can choose not to do it now. I might skip lunch because I want to eat a huge dessert at dinner when my wife and I go out for dinner. Well, doesn't show, you don't have free will when it comes to food because you're just not eating so you can eat more later. I think we'd all say, no, you can make a choice. The fact you can skip lunch shows that you have a choice about whether you eat or not, right? Addiction's not any different. She mentions studies. Addicts will sometimes quit short term just so they'll cut their tolerance so when they pick it back up, it'll have a bigger impact. Another bit of evidence here, higher taxes on alcohol use cut use even among the heaviest drinkers. There's studies from Australia. They adopted an alcohol tax. And even the heaviest drinkers, even people who are by any accepted definition an alcoholic, used less, drank less when these taxes went into effect. If addiction makes you into a mindless zombie, then you would break down the store, you would do whatever to get a drink. You certainly wouldn't drink less because it's more expensive, right? So this too tends to suggest this is evidence that addicts have a choice. Even people who are addicts seem like they can choose whether to do it or not. They have control. Give you guys one more example she doesn't talk about, but this is a really interesting one. During the Vietnam War, everybody who looked at drug use was terrified that there was going to be this mass wave of heroin addiction in the US because a lot of the soldiers in Vietnam used heroin. Well, there was some uptick in heroin use in the late 60s, early 70s, but the huge wave that people worried about never materialized. And the reason is that most people, when they left this situation, when they were no longer in a war zone, they stopped using heroin. There are lots of other studies like this, right? It's very sensitive to your environment. If you're in this stressful, awful environment where you're being shot at, you don't want to be there, well, it might make sense for you to do heroin in a way that it doesn't when you're home and you have responsibilities and things to look forward to, and heroin might mean losing out on those. So, very sensitive to environment, another reason to think that, it's not this disease, that addicts aren't just helpless in the face of an addiction, that they do have a choice. Well, let's look at the objections. You might be saying, well, but there's all these, whatever, there are these studies, but isn't there this really good evidence that addiction is a disease? First off, Alcoholics Anonymous claims addicts powerless in the face of addiction, right? Addiction is a disease. That is fundamental to AA, right? If AA says addiction is a disease, isn't that good evidence that addiction is in fact a disease? Another bit of evidence people often offer is that substance abuse changes your brain, right? It rewrites, they'll say, the reward pathways in your brain, the kinds of things that make you feel happy. It changes them. You can even, I think you can see this in MRIs, you can see that there are changes brought about by substance abuse. Finally, it's definitely inherited to some degree whether you have substance abuse problems, right? If your father or mother is an alcoholic, you are more likely to be an alcoholic than if they're not. If one of your uncles is an alcoholic, you're more likely to be an alcoholic than somebody who doesn't have an alcoholic uncle, less likely than somebody who has an alcoholic parent, right? So because there's this genetic component, doesn't that show that addiction is a disease, that it's not up to the person, right? Look, you can't choose who your family is. In some sense, you can't, right? Especially in the sense you can't choose what your genes are. You don't get a choice. If you have alcoholic or heroin addict genes, in the sense that they make you more likely to form a habit with this substance, doesn't that mean it's not your fault? Let's go through each of these because I think they're responses. Well, look, how much weight should we put into what Alcoholics Anonymous says about addiction being a disease? And Alcoholics Anonymous was formed turn of the century. They really knew nothing about the brain or neurology then, right? They really had no long-term psychological studies to back this up. The main evidence here seems to be that for at least some of the people in AA works. Well, how good of evidence is that, right? I'm not sure it's a slam dunk by any means. Think about this, right? The Atkins diet actually works in the sense you will lose weight if you follow the Atkins diet. I've known several people who do it. You take off a lot of weight very quickly. Atkins diet is you don't eat any carbs. You eat all like meat and protein, right? Now here's the thing. Atkins was actually completely wrong about why his diet worked. It works, because if you eat protein, you're full longer than if you eat carbohydrates. You'll eat more calories if you eat carbs because they don't keep you full and you eat more, right? Atkins had all these claims about what it did to your metabolism, meat making fundamental changes in how you burn calories. That all turns out to be false. So even though he gave us a diet that worked, he might not be right about how it works, right? And people in, AA, they say, well, our program works, so that must mean we're right about addiction, right? Now, the thing is, it doesn't work for everybody, right? So plenty of people AA does not work for. But even the people it does work for, that's not necessarily proof that they're right. You know, addiction is a disease. You have to avoid alcohol entirely. You can't help it. You need to surrender your will entirely. Well, that might keep people from using. They might be so terrified of alcohol, they don't even get near it. And if you don't get near it, you can't use it. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're right. And here's the thing. Even if AA were right, even if AA and the other related 12-step programs like Narcotics Anonymous were right about the people in their programs, that really wouldn't allow us to draw any kind of conclusions about addicts or problem users as a whole. The people in 12-step programs tend to be people who have, in the language of the programs themselves, hit bottom, right? They haven't just done things that mess up their lives. In a lot of cases, they've completely destroyed them, right? The people in these groups tend not to just be heavy users. They are the heaviest users. They are the people who have the worst problems with it. You know, it's not just addicts, it's the worst 10 or 20% of addicts. And so I think you could say, well, look, you can't generalize from this group to all people who have substance abuse problems. You know, just because the 10 or 20% of addicts who things get bad enough they go into Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous, just because this might be true of them, if it is true of them, doesn't mean it's true of this whole group, right? Again, this is a point the Drugs and Drug Policy book raises. Population in AA, Narcotics Anonymous, not representative even for people that would get classed as addicts by any definition of the term. In fact, I'll push a little harder here. A lot of experts will actually say this term addicts and addiction isn't useful. Why not? Because addict and addiction are binary concepts. Binary meaning either or, 1 or 0, black or white, you are or you aren't. And people who study substance abuse will make the point that really doesn't fit with actual substance abuse. There's a whole spectrum. You know, going all the way from the guy who never drinks, a little bit further down the line, the guy who has 1 beer a year at the Christmas party, down the line to the guy who has 2 or 3 drinks a week, down the line to the guy who has 4 or 5, down the line to the guy who has 20, down the line to the guy who has an eye opener when he gets up every morning, right? And the point here is plenty of people might be problem users who aren't addicts. And in fact, some people might sort of comfort themselves by saying, well, I'm not an addict by any definition of the term, even though they should worry because they are problem users, right? You know, I went to college with people like this, people who on Saturday night, Friday night, would get completely staggering drunk every single week, but they probably wouldn't meet any definition for alcoholism because, you know, Sunday through Thursday, they worked their butts off. They didn't touch alcohol, right? Can you quit? Yes, I quit every time I have a big exam. You know, can you choose whether to drink? Yeah. If I have class tomorrow, I'm not going to drink. Can you stop if you want to? Yes. Some of the people I went to undergrad with would say, I had a calculus exam I needed to really study for. I didn't drink a bit for 2 weeks, right? Point being, those people might still be problem users. If you get staggering blackout drunk every week, you might not be an addict. You are probably setting yourself up for some problems, right? So the thought is this term addiction does not capture the complexity of real substance use and abuse. In fact, it might allow some people who need to think about their substance abuse to just say, well, I'm not an addict. I don't meet those definitions. Shut up. I'll keep doing what I'm doing, right? Anyway, that's just a thought. But one of the reasons that I kind of push back and I'm skeptical on this term addiction is just because I do think it makes things way too neat. Anyway, that's kind of an aside. We'll leave that issue aside. But I don't think, the claims of AA and other 12-step programs, I don't think there's slam dunk evidence that addiction is a disease in the sense they claim. Well, let's get to this addiction changes the brain claim. Well, it does. Here's the thing, though. Lots of things change your brain. Lots of things not only change your brain, they rewrite your reward center, right? They've actually studied people who are cabbies in London, people who drive cabs in London, right? London is an incredibly complex, old city. Its streets are just a mess, right? It's huge. If you are a cabbie in London, you have to learn the geography of London like the back of your hand. It turns out that learning this actually makes your brain change. They've actually found that the section of your brain that is responsible for reasoning about sort of directions and spatial awareness actually gets bigger in cabbies. You can see it in an MRI scan. But look, no one would say that once you train to become a cabbie in London, you no longer have a choice about whether to be a cabbie, right? You can quit driving a cab even though driving a cab in London changes your brain. You are not helpless in the face of your cab driving, right? You can quit doing it anytime you get a better job. Even though it's changed your brain, it doesn't mean you've lost free will, whatever free will might be. Running. If you start running or you start any other exercise, it will also rewrite the reward centers of your brain. I can tell you this, when you first start running, you will hate it. Most everybody does. Why do I do this? I might as well just, stick my tongue in a 9-volt battery if I want like pain, right? Or if you ever did that when you're a kid, it shocks you. I don't know why I did that as a kid. That's a weird thing to do, but talked to a lot of other people who did it as a kid. I don't know. Anyway, but if you run for a bit, you start to really enjoy it. You start to really miss it on the mornings you don't. It rewrites the reward centers of your brain. You suddenly find learning enjoyable. Here's the thing, though. You are not powerless in the face of your running habit. You have a choice. I really sometimes wish that I wasn't, really wish sometimes that I didn't have a choice, right, about running, right? Because it'll be hot in the morning, and I'm like, I don't want to go running. It's really hot out there. It'll be raining or it'll be cold. If I really didn't have a choice about whether to go running, my clothes would fit a lot better than they do. My blood pressure would probably be a lot better than it does. Taking up running changes your brain. You still, sometimes I regret this, but you do still have a choice about whether you go running in the morning. Same goes for any kind of exercise. I don't know if they can tell this in MRI scans yet, but any class you take at TCC will, I am sure, change your brain, right? If you learn calculus, it will change your brain. Doesn't mean that you suddenly you have no choice about whether to do your math homework. You do, right? So the fact that addiction changes the brain certainly doesn't show that it means we don't have free will. Now look, once you take up running, it's probably a lot easier to make yourself go running in the morning. Habits are like that. Good habits, it gets to be easier. Bad habits, it gets to be harder. If you eat a donut after dinner every day, it's going to get harder not to eat a donut than it was before. But this whole talk about habits, we don't think that they strip you of free will, even if they might make things harder or easier. Well, another claim people might give is that there is an inheritable genetic component. And there are really good studies that show that there is a genetic component to alcoholism. And there is a genetic component. Alcoholism is the most studied just because, it's the most open, common form of addiction. But to the extent they have studied other addictions, there seems to be pretty clearly genetic components with them as well, right? If family members do it, you're more likely to do it too. If you have addicts in the family, you are more likely to become an addict yourself. There's also probably an environmental component if you see family members doing it, if you're raised in a certain environment, it makes you more likely to do it. That's a little less clear, it's been less studied, but that's almost certainly there too, right? Well, here's the thing though. A lot of traits that we have pretty clearly have genetic components as well. Temper, how angry you get about things, has a genetic component. Other personality traits have a genetic component. As you get older, you will find yourself acting like your parents a lot of times, right? Sometimes, good traits your parents have, you might be happy about that. Traits your parents have that annoyed you, you might be completely, might not be happy at all about it, right? But personality, how people act, certainly has a genetic component. But do we say that people aren't responsible for their actions because of that? Let me give you guys an example by way of a somewhat long story. I promise this will get back to what we're talking about in a second. So look, I have kind of a bad temper, right? And it runs in my family. My mom has a nasty temper. My uncles, her brothers have nasty tempers. It kind of goes back. You can ask people about the family going back a generation or two. Tend to get angry, quite angry, and angry pretty easily, right? Now look, I don't know how much of this is genetic, how much of it is environment, certainly some element that's environment, but there's probably a huge genetic component to it, right? My mom has a bad temper, my uncles have bad tempers, I have a bad temper, right? But would we say if I lose my temper and do something that I'm not responsible for, right? I'll tell you guys this story, right? So when my wife and I first moved to Virginia Beach, we got a condo in this complex. House hunt was terrible. It was the first one that was halfway decent. So I usually walk our dog, we have a little Jack Russell looking dog. Looks like Eddie from Frasier, except, she's kind of fat, right? So picture a fat Eddie from Frasier. We've tried to take the weight off, but, like us, the dog also likes to eat, right? So look, I walk my little dog every morning in our complex. But one morning I had to go into work for a meeting. I had to go in early, so my wife has to walk the dog, right? So my wife's black, right? And this is important because I've walked the dog every single day and no one's ever hassled me. The one morning she walks the dog, one of our neighbors comes out of his condo, starts asking her what she's doing in the condo complex. She tells him, I'm walking my dog. He's like, you don't have any right to be here. She's like, I live here. And he's like, I want you to prove. Take me to your apartment. Prove to me you live here, right? He's got the phone out. He's threatening to call cops. He's acting crazy. He basically chases her back to our apartment because he thinks she shouldn't be in our condo complex, right? Now look, this is bad on so many levels, all right? For one thing, our neighbor is a racist ass because I've done the same thing a dozen mornings in a row at least at the same time, and this guy's never hassled me. He's also an idiot because, our dog looks like Eddie from Frasier, pretty memorable looking little dog. kind of should maybe infer, oh, it's the same dog that walks by my house every morning, right? I mean, even if there wasn't like the racial component here, this is just bad behavior, right? If somebody is walking through your condo complex, you're just a huge jerk to hassle them if they're not damaging anything. They're walking over your pavement. I mean, at 8 in the morning? What has to be wrong with you that that's an issue, right? Well, anyway, why I tell this story is this. My wife tells me about it. She's upset. She gets over it in a few days, though, right? But she points this guy out to me. And I wanted to go out and basically tell this guy off. She tells me not to. In fact, I wanted to do more than go out and tell this guy off. I wanted to go out and punch him in the nose, right? Like I said, I have a bad temper sometimes, right? I wanted to go punch this guy in the nose. I fantasized about it, right? Now look, I'm a philosophy professor. Punching him in the nose probably wouldn't go the way I think it does, where, I throw this Mike Tyson punch and put him on the ground. Probably I would throw a haymaker and miss him, or if I did hit him, it would probably be me like shaking my fist going, ow, 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 right? Philosophy professors are not known for our ability to throw a good punch. But my point here is, look, if I had went out and punched this guy in the face, if I were charged with assault for it, I couldn't very well say, oh, look, my mom has a bad temper, my uncle has a bad temper, so I have a bad temper, right? All of that might be true. I might get angrier about this than somebody else would who doesn't have the genetic predisposition to have a bad temper. I've known friends who are a lot more chill than I am. Their parents seem a lot more relaxed, willing to let things slide than my mom does. They probably wouldn't, I wouldn't punch him, honestly, but my friends wouldn't even fantasize about punching him in the face, right? And that might be due to a genetic component, but if I did punch this guy in the face, even though my temper, my anger at this, my wanting to do that might be partially due to genetics, I would still be responsible for making the decision to hit this guy, right? He also used to park his car where the dog poop bags were, so I'd walk by his car every morning throwing away the dog's poop. I also fantasized about smashing his windshield. Didn't do that either, but again, if I'd smashed his windshield, if I got brought into court, I couldn't very well say, look at my mom, look at my uncles. I'm a passive victim of genetics, right? Even if I get angry about this in ways that people who don't have my genetics wouldn't, even if that's true, I'm still responsible for making the choice whether to smash his window or not, right? Anyway, it's funny, I told my mom about this and I expected her to be like, oh, you shouldn't do things like that, would be irresponsible. And she's like, oh, you should stick some gravel under his wiper blades. If you stick some gravel, he turns them on, he'll scratch his windows up. Never know who did it, have to replace his windshield. I love my mom. She's great. I admire her in a lot of ways. Forgive and forget is not high up on her list of values. Anyway, so my point being, I definitely have a genetic predisposition to have a temper. If I lose my temper and do something, I would still be responsible, right? In the same way, even if someone has a genetic predisposition to have substance abuse problems, unless we want to say, well, people aren't responsible for anything genetic, which just seems ridiculous. You would have to let me off for slugging this guy if I did it. Unless you want to say that, I don't think we can say the mere fact that there's an inheritable genetic component means that addicts don't have free will. Okay, so it does seem, by any sort of pragmatic definition of free will, of choice, that addicts have free will, they have choice. Okay, so to sum up, where does this leave us, just to kind of sum up the whole thing on drug use? So from what I know, it is incredibly hard to argue that we should keep drug laws as they are. We spend too much money on it. I think Boaz is right about this. We, you know, we end up sending people to jail for a lot longer than we should. We have a system where fundamental rights like due process, property, things like that get violated. We should definitely reform our drug laws in some ways. But where do we go from there? Well, I think one thing we should agree on is that we don't really want to punish users harshly. It doesn't work. It doesn't keep them from using. As the Hi-Fi Nation makes clear, it's kind of counterproductive. Counterproductive in the sense it doesn't keep them from using. In fact, if you really throw the book at them and you deprive them of hope, it might make it much more likely that they'll use, right? And it's really hard to find any other rationale for heavy punishments for users, right? You know, as they mention in passing in Hi-Fi Nation, we can talk about what the point of punishment is. It might be to discourage behavior we don't like. Some other people will say the point of punishment is to give people what they deserve when they've acted wrongly. If you do something wrong, you deserve punishment, right? Even if we accept that latter one, it's hard to argue that users have done something so wrong, so bad, that they deserve super heavy punishments just for using, right? How much damage have you really done to society? You know. So I think it's hard to come up with a good rationale for super heavy punishments for users. And it's hard to justify the resources we spend on locking up users and the rest of the drug war. That much I think we should all agree on, or at least from what I know about the facts. Look, I've told you guys I'm not an expert on these issues. If you find evidence that drug laws work better than they seem to, that heavy punishments work better than they seem to, that our current enforcement is justified, that it's worth what we pay for it, well, you know, I might be wrong. I'm willing to listen to that. I've read a couple books on this. I'm not an expert on it. There's a chance I'm wrong about the facts. But from what I know, the facts I'm familiar with so far say that we should make some fundamental reforms to drug policy. Shorter sentences, less enforcement, less spent on the drug war generally. Now, it's interesting. I think liberals / progressives, whatever you want to call yourself if you are liberal, and libertarians can agree on that much. It's interesting because there's been like a sort of coalition of people on the left, liberals, and also people on the right, at least libertarians on the right, like the Koch brothers, on these issues of drug laws, right? Both liberals and libertarians, like the Kochs, think that we should have much lighter sentences for drug use, drug selling. They also think we shouldn't spend as many resources on the drug war. But I think liberals and progressives and libertarians, people on this conservative side of the economic spectrum, will come apart after that. If you are a liberal, you will probably say, you'll listen to the Hi-Fi Nation, you'll hear about these programs, treating addicts like they have a disease, giving them a lot of support. And you'll say, well, look, there's evidence that works, that it helps people stop using. Let's do that because there's a good utilitarian rationale. We'll give these people help. That'll lead to them stopping using. That's better for everybody. We should not only lessen penalties for using drugs, we should not only lessen enforcement, we should take the money we spend on that kind of stuff, locking people up, heavy enforcement for drug laws, and we should spend that money on helping addicts, helping problem users, because that will have good consequences. That's not what the libertarian is going to say. The libertarian will say, look, I agree with you liberals. It's a waste of money to send people to jail for so long. It's a waste of money to spend the amount of resources we do on drug enforcement. It is a scandal and a crime that we violate people's fundamental liberties in the name of the drug war. Yes, I agree with you on all of that. But I think the libertarian will say, let's take all the money we spend in the drug war and either just cut taxes with it or do something else. Why in the world think we're under any obligation to help drug users? Libertarian will say, well, look, if they make a choice, if they're responsible, why are we obligated to help them? You know, look, we might be obligated to help the guy who literally can't work through no fault of his own. But if addicts can help it, it might be hard for them. Might not be an easy choice, but if they can help it, why are we obligated to help them? Now look, I don't know which side of this debate I would honestly come down on, right? I think the liberal has a good utilitarian case. On the other hand, the libertarian will make claims of personal responsibility. They'll also make claims of property rights, right? If you create a problem for yourself through your own decisions, why should you have a right to my property to help you? So I don't know. I'll say this. It's not clear that Kantianism dictates the libertarian position, but I do think the libertarians can make a good Kantian case. If it really is someone else's choice, then we'll respect their choice, we'll let them make it. But are we obligated to help people when they make bad choices? Now look, this is a question I'm going to come back to when we get to the segment on distributive justice. This issue will resurface. What do people owe each other? But just for the time being, I think it's interesting because, the facts are what they are here, but I think there are different responses. I probably shouldn't tip my hand to you guys, but I'll be honest, my wife and I have discussed this. She kind of leans way more toward the liberal side of this. At least on drug issues, I'm kind of sympathetic to the libertarian claim. I don't know. It's not clear to me which is right, but I hope I've gotten you guys to at least see different directions you can go with this, and in that there are different directions you can go with this, where the disagreement might be, why liberals might go in one direction, why libertarians, people who do think there should be reforms in the drug law but are more conservative, especially about property and economic issues, might go in another.